Professor Brian Wildenthal. The talk I'm going to give today is about early Shakespeare authorship doubts, the Oxfordian connections. In a broad sense, this talk is drawn from my book published last year, Early Shakespeare Authorship Doubts, but it's also going to zero in more closely and follow up on that book by exploring the connections between these early published expressions of doubt about who the author Shakespeare and the theory that Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford, was the true author. Now, I'll say right off the top, you're welcome to email me at bryanw@gmail.com, BRYANW, and I'll be glad to send you my PowerPoint slides, some free excerpts from my book, and some additional information documenting the points made in the talk. There were two key lessons I learned while writing this book. First of all, defenders of the traditional Stratfordian theory of Shakespeare authorship are deeply invested in the false yet widely repeated claim that nobody had any doubts about the Shakespeare authorship until hundreds of years after the time he lived. But in reality, there were dozens of published expressions of doubt during his own lifetime. Think about it. Doubts and questions about who this author was began appearing more than 30 years before the first folio of 1623, which was the first publication to promote, although ambiguously and very suspiciously, the theory that William Shakespeare of Stratford was the true author. The second key lesson I learned is that all of us in the authorship debate, all sides in this debate, both defenders of the traditional theory and those of us who question and criticize that theory, should be careful to read each other's work more respectfully and carefully to advance the search for truth, not just to score points. So in that spirit, cast of key characters to keep in mind during this talk. In Renaissance England, we have, of course, William Shakespeare of Stratford upon Avon, the traditionally credited author Shakespeare, sometime actor, a known businessman, apparently a theater investor, born in 1564, and died in 1616. Now, there aren't too many dates I'll ask you to focus on during this talk, but that's one of them. That's an important one. 1616, the year that the traditionally credited author Shakespeare of Stratford, or Shakestrat as we might call him, died. We don't know for sure how he pronounced his name. Some authorship skeptics suggest it may have been Shakespeare because in his personal records it often appears without the first E or the second A, but we don't really know for sure. There's no record, other than Ben Jonson's ambiguous posthumous statements, mainly in the first folio, no record that anyone who knew this person thought he was a writer during his own lifetime. Even Orthodox scholars concede that basic point. No clear evidence dating to his own lifetime that he was even a writer. Now, of course, there was a published author who appeared to have the name William Shakespeare. Similar but not identical name, and the way this name appeared on published works between 1593, mainly up through 1604, was spelled exactly like this, sometimes hyphenated, but exactly as we spell it today, and very consistently spelled that way, in contrast to the wildly inconsistent spellings of the businessman from Stratford when he was using his own name on ordinary business documents. There was a notable stall in the publications of this author in 1604, the publication 93 with Venus and Adonis, and then largely concluded in 1604 after the first two quartos of Hamlet were published. In fact, many Orthodox scholars used to suggest that this author, whoever it was, must have retired in 1604, perhaps back to Stratford. The sonnets published in 1609 appear to be posthumous. They're dedicated to our ever-living author, a term always used to refer to a deceased person or to express the hope that a person might live on through their artworks or in a religious or spiritual sense. Never used as a flat description of a person who is still living, only to describe someone who is already dead. Everyone agrees the first folio of 1623 was posthumous. Now, I won't have time to dwell too much on the sonnets in this talk, but it's all in my book, and in fact I do have a few slides in the PowerPoints about the sonnets, so you can read more about that if you wish. Oddest of all, there are many apparent references to this author, William Shakespeare, going back to the 1580s, or even earlier. Much too early, it seems, for the timeline of the businessman, Shakespeare of Stratford. Two more key characters in Renaissance England. Ben Jonson, the contemporary, perhaps rival of the author Shakespeare. Jonson wrote two laudatory poems in the 1623 folio, the first folio of Shakespeare, and many scholars, even Orthodox scholars, believe that he likely ghost wrote other parts of the folio preface, including the two letters supposedly by Hemmings and Condell. Jonson may well have been the primary editor or impresario of the folio, which does raise the question, can we trust anything Jonson says, or anything the folio suggests about authorship, when it appears to be misrepresenting right off the bat who wrote the prefatory material, or much of the prefatory material. Jonson's own folio in 1616, Jonson published a folio of his own plays 7 years before the famous Shakespeare folio, and this was just a few months after Shakespeare of Stratford died in 1616. And yet Jonson's folio coldly ignores Shakespeare, except that the name pops up twice in cast lists for two Jonson plays. So Jonson's conceding only that this guy maybe showed up as an actor in two of his own, Jonson's, plays. Another key character, Edward de Vere, the 17th Earl of Oxford. For a century now, many people have believed that this may have been the true author behind the pen name of the published author, whose works were published sometimes anonymously and sometimes under the name William Shakespeare. Oxford died in 1604, and that's the other key date to keep in mind. 12 years before 1616, when Shakespeare of Stratford died, de Vere, the Earl of Oxford, died. We'll call him Oxford. Now, Oxford was known to be a patron of musician crews. He apparently expended much of his fortune supporting artists and theatrical ventures. He was hailed by his contemporaries as one of the finest poets and playwrights of the Elizabethan age, even though we have no plays or poems that we can connect to his name, other than possibly the works of Shakespeare. He was known to have traveled, his education, his relationships, his life events. He traveled in Europe. All of these facts match perfectly with the works of Shakespeare and the apparent knowledge and experiences and education reflected in the works, explaining why he's been recognized by many as the likely author. Three more key characters in ancient Rome. Seneca the Younger, many of you may have heard of this tragic playwright and Stoic philosopher. Ben Jonson compared him to Shakespeare because they both wrote tragic dramas. Ovid, well-known Roman poet, everyone agrees that he deeply influenced the author Shakespeare. 1598 book said Shakespeare possessed, quote, the sweet, witty soul of Ovid. And then Terence. Many of you may have heard of Ovid. Terence, perhaps less well-known to many people. He was a comic playwright in ancient Rome. And here's the catch. He was viewed, and has been viewed for more than 2,000 years, as the very archetype of an alleged frontman. Now, modern scholars think that Terence, who was born an African slave and then was brought to Rome and began a literary career, modern scholars think he probably did write his own works. But ever since the time of Cicero, the great Roman orator, he was viewed or suspected as being a frontman. Michel de Montaigne, the Renaissance essayist, viewed him as a classical, prototypical frontman. Many other writers also thought that. Terence was specifically believed to have been a frontman for two Roman aristocrats who were thought to have actually written his works. Now, why am I talking about all three of these Roman writers? Aren't we in Elizabethan times? We're focusing on the age of Shakespeare. Well, these Roman writers are significant because three key publications during the lifetime of Shakespeare of Stratford seem to refer to the author Shakespeare, whoever that was, in a way connected to each of these Roman writers, connected in very curious ways that raise some profound questions. A 1589 book, when Shakespeare was only 25 years old, barely out of Stratford, as far as we know, alludes to the unnamed author of Hamlet and its tragical speeches as English Seneca. A 1605 pamphlet, 11 years before Shakespeare of Stratford died, refers amongst many more Hamlet references to the late English Ovid. The late English Ovid, even though it's still years before the Shakespeare that we know of Stratford died. And then in 1611, the title of a poem addresses Mr. Will Shakespeare, the actor, as our English Terence, publicly calling him a frontman. So let's dive into these three publications. 1589, the preface to Menaphon. Menaphon was a romance by Robert Greene, a writer, another interesting writer we won't have time to explore in this talk. It's all in my book. Thomas Nash wrote the premise. Nash was a fairly minor Elizabethan writer. He addressed the preface to the gentlemen students of both universities, meaning Oxford and Cambridge, seemed to be advising them about authors to read. He said, English Seneca, read by candlelight, yields many good sentences. Blood is a beggar, and so forth. And if you entreat him fair in a frosty morning, he will afford you Hamlets, I should say handfuls of tragical speeches. So there's a number of references here that seem to be talking about Hamlet. Sonnet 67 by Shakespeare has the odd line, beggared of blood, matching that phrase, blood is a beggar, a phrase not found in any English translation of Seneca. So this seems to be a reference to the author of Hamlet. Again, keep in mind that Shakespeare was compared to Seneca by Ben Jonson in the Folio, Francis Mears also in 1598. There's only one mention of Seneca in the works of Shakespeare, in Hamlet. Now the oddity about this is, we think of this preface in 1589 referring to Hamlet and seeming to refer, although without naming him, to the author of Hamlet. Consider Occam's razor. If you look it up, Occam's razor is the philosophical principle of simplicity. It's not a rigid rule or law of logic, but it is viewed as a suggestion that all things being equal, we should probably prefer the simpler and more direct explanation for a known set of facts. So, did Shakespeare of Stratford write Hamlet when he was only 25? Had he already written it in 1589 when he was barely out of Stratford? Was he already so well known by age 25 that other writers would not even allude to him by name, but as English Seneca? Scholars Hamlet to much later, more than a decade later, in 1600. So they've come up with this convoluted theory, devoid of any supporting evidence, that there was some Hamlet, an earlier play by that name, written by some other author, and maybe that's what Nash was referring to. Or maybe Nash and Shakespeare's Hamlet are both based on this earlier Hamlet. Remarkably contorted and convoluted explanation, when it simply seems this is an early reference to the play Hamlet, or an early version of it. If there's any more blatant violation of Occam's razor in the field of literary history than the Hamlet theory, an example does not come readily to mind. The 1605 pamphlet. This was entitled Sir Thomas Smith's Voyage and Entertainment in Russia. It describes basically the time when England's ambassador to Russia at that time, Sir Thomas Smith, was at the court of the Russian Tsar, Boris Godunov, who was violently overthrown that year. His son and successor was also murdered. His widow was also murdered as well. This pamphlet appeared from the same printer as the two Hamlet quartos. And it describes all these violent events in the Russian court of the Tsar in terms connecting them to the similarly violent melodrama in the court of Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. It says it's like the poetical fury and full tragedies, a first but no second to any Hamlet, and revenge, just revenge, was coming. Case of life imitates art, perhaps. Now, Voyage's author in 1605 also muses about which writer might be suited to dramatize this real-life Russian version of Hamlet. Shakespeare is not mentioned by name. However, the pamphlet does say, quote, "I am with the late English, quick-spirited, clear-sighted Ovid," and goes on to refer to dreaming and other things. We can paraphrase this. The writer seems to be saying, I agree with the recently deceased English Ovid, a quick-witted and perceptive writer. Now, could these be echoes of Hamlet? As we just saw, there are a number of references, explicit references to Hamlet and allusions in the pamphlet. Well, Jan Cole, in a brilliant 2014 article, she deserves credit for recognizing the significance of this 1608. And Alexander Waugh, in a very cogent follow-up essay in 2018, they link 4 key themes in this 1605 pamphlet to the Shakespeare canon, and specifically Hamlet. Fear, dreaming, sleep, and silence. If you go back and read Hamlet's famous soliloquy, "To be or not to be," you'll see a strong collection of references to these themes. So who is English Ovid? My money is on the author of Hamlet, the author, the one described as the sweet, witty soul of Ovid. Sir Jonathan Bate, a modern Orthodox Stratfordian scholar, has written the book on it. Wonderful book, Shakespeare and Ovid. Martindale and Martindale, 2 Orthodox authors, commented in 1990 that Shakespeare, quote, "started his career with a deliberate attempt to present himself as something of an English Ovid." Here we have a reference in 1605 by a contemporary of the time saying the late English Ovid in a context where there are many references to Hamlet. And yet, how could this refer to Shakespeare of Stratford, who died in 1616? This reference to a recently deceased author of Hamlet would fit perfectly with Oxford, who died in 1604. Lastly, 1611, the poem addressing Shakespeare as our English Terence. This poem is by John Davies of Hereford, not to be confused with Sir John Davies MP. There were actually 2 authors, writers and poets, known as John Davies during this time. A reminder that sometimes having the same name is not necessarily an indicator that we're talking about the same person. So Davies of Hereford titled his epigram in this book, The Scourge of Folly, epigram number 159, to our English Terence, Mr. Will Shakespeare. And it seems to address the actor, refers to him playing kingly parts in sport, seems to refer to him as a player. The references to kings and kingly parts could be a reference to the king's men, the theatrical comfort was part of. But again, who the heck was Terence? And why is he calling Shakespeare English Terence? Again, recall, Terence has been viewed for more than 2,000 years as the prototypical frontman. Now, he was a comic playwright also, but Shakespeare was both a comic and a tragic playwright, as reflected in the references to him as English Seneca. The most likely reason for this reference is that Davies is basically calling Shakespeare the actor a frontman. Frontman, then there's someone lurking behind the frontman, the true author. And indeed, the very next epigram, long overlooked, Alexander Waugh has pointed this out to us. Epigram number 160 is addressed to his, that is, English Terence's, Shakespeare's, to his most constant, though most unknown friend, nobody. These 2 epigrams together are strongly hinting a kind of frontman scenario. All right, as we launch into the final segment of my talk, I did want to emphasize that my work in my book and this talk has relied very heavily on the work of many other scholars who have explored these early Shakespeare authorship doubts. I mentioned the articles by Jan Cole and Alexander Waugh about the 1605 pamphlet, and my work in general has relied on too many authors to mention here, but I would single out in particular Diana Price and Catherine Children for all the work they've done on early Shakespeare authorship doubts. So let's explore further now the connections between some of these early expressions of doubt and Oxford, Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. We did see already that the method is suggestively consistent with Oxford, who died in 1604. Reference in 1605 suggesting that the author of Hamlet is very recently deceased. A reference that it does not fit, is wildly inconsistent with Shakespeare of Stratford, who didn't die until 1616. And there are, in fact, a number of references. The sonnets in 1609, a total of 5 references, which I explore in more depth in my book, which seem to suggest the author Shakespeare, whoever it was, died many years before 1616. Let's look at Ben Jonson. There's a number of intriguing connections hinting that Oxford was the author in various epigrams and plays by Ben Jonson, all of which were collected in the 1616 folio of Jonson's works, but had been written, performed, or published many years earlier. Now, many scholars have talked about Jonson's epigram on Poet Ape. There have been many suggestions that Poet Ape is perhaps a mocking reference to Shakespeare of Stratford, and many have linked that character in that Jonson epigram, characters like Soliardo in a Jonson play, as we'll see. Jonson seems to depict this character as kind of a theatrical wheeler-dealer, perhaps stealing the work of other writers, passing it off as his own. Also suggests that most playgoers of the time, to Jonson's own chagrin, really couldn't have cared less who the real authors were. A reminder to us with great fascination, this authorship question, and we sometimes wonder if there was a question, wouldn't people have talked about it then or figured it out? Well, they may have gossiped about it, but may not have put that down in writing, and many of them may not have cared, frankly, who the author was. So we shouldn't necessarily expect to see smoking gun recognitions of that issue just because it fascinates us today, because of how great a writer we believe Shakespeare was. We should generally keep in mind the first epigram that Jonson wrote or published in his works. He said to the reader, "Pray thee take care that takest my book in hand, to read it well, that is, to understand." So let's dive in and look a little bit more closely here. Jonson's play, Every Man Out of His Humor, included in the 1616 folio, but it was performed in 1599 and first published in quarto in 1600. The character in this play, Soliardo, was a crassly ambitious, buffoonish commoner. Now, Soliardo is an Italian name for a stock character type. John Florio's Italian-English Dictionary, Jonson was a friend of Florio's. Again, even many Orthodox scholars view the Soliardo character in Every Man Out as a send-up of Shakespeare of Stratford. Soliardo boasts laughably and cluelessly about his name and his coat of arms, which features, oddly, a headless boar. Sir Puntarvolo, another character in the play, and another stock character name from Florio's Italian-English Dictionary, asks Soliardo to explain Soliardo's coat of arms. Soliardo replies, "Sir, it is your boar without a head." We'll come back to the headless boar in just a second. Now, another play by Ben Jonson, Poetaster, performed 1601, published in 1602, has another character similar to Soliardo or Poet Ape, Crispinus, a gauche would-be gentleman. In Act 2 of the play, he says, "My name is Crispinus," or Crispinus, indeed. Act 5, he's described as Crispinus, alias Crispinus, two hyphenated versions of the name, Poetaster, and Plagiary. Poetaster essentially refers to someone who's not a real poet, but is sort of faking it, a would-be poet. And of course, plagiarism is openly referenced there. Now, why did Jonson choose these character names? They're stock character names drawn from this Italian dictionary, apparently. But among all the limitless options, why did he name these particular characters Crispinus or Puntarvolo? Well, if you dig deeper, if you look at the two parts of the name Crispinus, the first part, crispo, is the Latin verb to brandish or move rapidly, i.e. to shake. And spinus, referring to the Latin word for thumb, the same spica or spike comes from the same Latin root. This could easily be viewed as a veiled reference to Shakespeare, crispo spinus. Puntarvolo, if you flip around the order of the two parts of that name, volo is the Latin word for will. In Italian also, voluntas, will. Punto or punta or puntura is a stroke or thrust with the point. So this name, Puntarvolo reversed, suggests will spear. And there's even an interesting issue. The word tarasso is the Greek word for shake. And so if Johnson was perhaps hinting or exploiting some suggestion of the word for shake in Greek with the syllable tar, this would actually suggest, if you flip around the order, will, shake, spear. Richard Mallon was a scholar who first suggested this intriguing connection. So what can we learn from this in the Johnson plays? There's a scholar, apparently an Orthodox scholar, another gentleman by the name of Mark Anderson, not the Oxfordian scholar Mark Anderson that many of us know and admire, who commented that the Italian names in Every Man Out are like hieroglyphics, signs with hidden truths accessible through reason and learning, and saying that Johnson's historical characters in Poetaster and Every Man Out are the foundation for the artistic truths of these plays. Dramas which, according to this writer, Mark Anderson, in this 1981 article, have been frequently misunderstood and underrated. Now again, Mark Anderson, the author of this article, was apparently an Orthodox scholar. I don't think was intending to comment on the authorship question, but these are very intriguing comments to keep in mind as we dig further for these connections. As Ben Jonson himself said, read it well to understand. So whom was Puntarvolo, Will Spear, meant to represent? There are suggestions not only linking Puntarvolo to the name Shakespeare, but also to aspects of the author Shakespeare and to Oxford, thought to be by many the true author behind the pseudonym. We saw several slides earlier that Johnson uses Soliardo in that dialogue with Puntarvolo to imply that Puntarvolo's own coat of arms includes a boar. Oxford's coat of arms also famously included a boar. And think about why Johnson put a headless boar on Soliardo's coat of arms, perhaps suggesting a frontman lacking literally the true writer's brain. If Puntarvolo had the boar, Oxford had the boar, it was his frontman, the headless boar. Now, it's implied to be more than a knight, as this description of the character would imply. He's suggested to be a nobleman, a fine horseman and jouster. He indulges in aristocratic pastimes like falconry, hunting with dogs. Oxford was well known to be a champion jouster at Elizabeth's court. Sir Puntarvolo was said to quixotically brandish a sword. He was an egotistical romance, and described him. Another character describes him, saying he would court his own lady, his own wife, like a stranger never before encountered, and make fresh love to her every morning. He's described as a vainglorious knight, over-Englishing his travels, fond of, quote, strange performances, resolving in despite of public derision to stick to his own particular fashion, phrase, and gesture, unquote. One thinks of Sonnet 76, why write I still, all one, ever the same, and keep invention in a noted weed. Puntarvolo is even said to recite dialogues, quote unquote, to, quote, his horse, himself, and his dog. Quite an eccentric artistic figure overall, it might seem. If this doesn't sound a little bit like the author Shakespeare, I'm not sure who would. Now, Johnson may have given us a clue to how Edward de Vere, or Oxford, viewed Shakespeare of Stratford, if they had an author-frontman relationship. Puntarvolo says to Soliardo, Sirrah, keep close, yet not so close. Thy breath will thaw my ruff. For this and the other quotations in these slides, you can see every man out of his humor, the character summaries, which Johnson provides at the beginning, also Act 2, Scene 1, Act 3, Scene 4. Now, all these connections between Puntarvolo and Oxford are, of course, speculative and debatable, and the 1605 reference to the late English Ovid, although it is suggestively consistent with Oxford's date of death, does not pinpoint Oxford as the author. But there is more. The most startlingly explicit Oxfordian connection among the early doubts is the 1595 book Polymantia by William Covell. The Covell anagram that appears in this book was discovered by Alexander Waugh in 2013, only 7 years ago, a reminder of how analyzed evidence has arisen over the past century, tending to corroborate the Oxfordian hypothesis published in 1920. Such repeated confirmation by evidence is a surefire sign that any theory is correct. There can be little, if any, serious doubt that this 1595 text, Polymantia, is an intentional anagram. It's a patently odd three-word phrase, 16 letters, court, dear verse, linked by hyphens, obviously calling attention to itself. It leaves no room for subjectivity or cherry-picking as to what the plain text is if we analyze this as an anagram. Could it be random chance that these 16 letters in this very distinct marked-off phrase can be reassembled in a perfect anagram, that is, not omitting any letter and not reusing any letter, as, quote, our De Vere, a secret? Is it possible that this is random chance, that this perfect anagram appears right below a reference in the text to Oxford, or that it's adjacent to a printed note in the margin referring to sweet Shakespeare? That if you look at 9 of these 16 letters, without even reshuffling them, they spell out our De Vere? Or that the person thus linked to Shakespeare, Oxford, just happens to be the same person as to whom numerous writers with no knowledge of the anagram have found a myriad of other connections and linkages circumstantially suggesting that he was the author Shakespeare. If you think that it's reasonably likely that all of this could be random chance, you need to read more about the laws of probability. Now, time precludes going any further in this. I'll have to wind up this talk, but everything is in my book. There are many more details in the book and further details in the PowerPoint slides and excerpts that I can send you. So again, feel free to contact me at brianw@gmail.com. I'll be delighted to send you these additional materials. I would note, and I've assembled some tables looking at all 36 of the key early published expressions of authorship doubt before Shakespeare of Stratford died in 1616. And of those 36 items, a solid majority of 56%, suggests the author Shakespeare was some kind of aristocrat. 13 of these items, more than 1/3 of them, suggest in some way that Oxford may have been that aristocratic author, building upon the references in the Covell anagram, the suggestions in the Puntarvolo scenes of Jonson's play. 14 of the 36 references, 39%, suggest that some kind of frontman or plagiarism scenario was involved. 24 of them, 2/3 of these references, suggest that Shakespeare was indeed a pseudonym or pen name, quite possibly the pen name used by Edward de Vere, the Earl of Oxford. Thank you.